August 1945, Philippines. Japanese women captured by American forces prepared for the worst: torture, execution, or worse horrors they'd been warned about their entire lives. But when a U.S. soldier told them through an interpreter, "You can swim in the river if you want, we'll give you privacy," they thought it was a cruel trick before their deaths. What these women discovered in that POW camp would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. But would anyone back home ever believe what really happened to them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1945, the Pacific War was entering its final and most desperate months. Japan was losing, and everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it out loud. The empire that had promised glory and honor was crumbling under the weight of American bombs and blockades. Cities were burning, food was scarce. Mothers fed their children watered-down rice porridge and told them to be strong for the emperor. The government had spent years telling its people that Americans were monsters, devils who would show no mercy to prisoners. Surrender, they said, was worse than death. It was the ultimate shame, a stain that could never be washed away. Women across Japan had been pulled into the war effort in ways their mothers never imagined. They worked in factories making bullets and airplane parts. They served as nurses in field hospitals, watching young soldiers die from wounds that could not be healed. They joined communication units, sending coded messages across vast distances. These women were told they were serving the emperor, protecting their homeland, honoring their families. They believed it because they had no reason not to. The propaganda was everywhere, in every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every poster on every wall. Kimiko was 22 years old and had been working as a communications clerk in the Philippines. She came from a small town near Osaka where her father ran a bicycle repair shop. Before the war, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher. Now she spent her days hunched over radio equipment in a hot, cramped building, translating messages and monitoring frequencies. Reiko was 27, a field nurse from Okinawa who had seen more death in 2 years than most people see in a lifetime. She had gentle hands and a quiet voice, and she never let the soldiers see her cry, even when there was nothing left she could do for them. Sachiko was only 19, the youngest of the three. She had been pulled from a textile factory in Kyoto and sent to work in a munitions plant in Manila. She was small and nervous, with quick hands that never seemed to stop moving. By July 1945, the American forces were advancing fast. The Japanese retreat was chaotic and brutal. Orders came and went, supply lines collapsed. Kimiko, Reiko, and Sachiko found themselves trapped with a small group of other women and wounded soldiers as American troops closed in. They hid in the jungle for 3 days, drinking rainwater from leaves and eating nothing. They could hear the rumble of American tanks in the distance, the crack of gunfire, the shouting in a language they did not understand. When the American soldiers finally found them, the women were too weak and too scared to run. Kimiko remembered the moment the first American soldier appeared through the trees. He was tall, with sunburned skin and tired eyes. He held his rifle loosely, not pointed at them. He said something in English, then raised his hands to show he meant no harm. An interpreter, a Japanese American soldier, stepped forward. He spoke to them in their own language, but his accent was strange, softer. He told them they were prisoners now. He told them they would not be hurt. Kimiko did not believe him. How could she? Everything she had been taught said this was a lie, a trap. She looked at Reiko, who stared straight ahead with empty eyes. She looked at Sachiko, who was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. They were loaded onto trucks and driven for hours along bumpy dirt roads. No one spoke. The American soldiers offered them water, but most of the women were too afraid to drink it. What if it was poisoned? What if this kindness was just a game before the real horror began? Kimiko clutched a small photo of her family that she kept hidden in her sleeve. She thought about her mother's face, her father's laugh, the way the cherry blossoms looked in spring. She wondered if she would ever see them again. The POW camp sat beside a slow-moving river surrounded by thick jungle. Barbed wire fences stretched in a wide rectangle, and guard towers rose at each corner. Quonset huts made of curved metal lined the inside of the compound. It looked like a prison, because that is what it was. But it was cleaner than Kimiko expected, quieter. There were no screams, no sounds of torture, just the hum of insects and the distant murmur of American voices. That first night, the women were given medical checks by American nurses who smiled and spoke softly. They were handed blankets that smelled like soap. They were assigned beds in one of the huts. The beds had thin mattresses and clean sheets. Kimiko lay on hers and stared at the ceiling, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Outside, she could hear American soldiers laughing, playing cards, talking about home. It did not make sense. Where was the cruelty? Where was the violence? She had been promised that capture meant suffering beyond imagination. Instead, she had a bed and a blanket. The next morning, an American guard approached their hut. He was young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles. He carried a clipboard and looked nervous. The interpreter came with him. The guard said something, and the interpreter turned to the women. His words were simple and clear. "You can bathe in the river if you want. We will give you privacy. Female guards will watch to make sure you are safe." Kimiko felt her heart stop. She looked at the other women. Their faces showed the same confusion, the same disbelief. A bath? In a river? With privacy? It had to be a trick. Maybe they would be taken to the river and shot. Maybe this was how the Americans killed their prisoners, by giving them false hope first. But the interpreter's face was calm. The guard looked away, as if embarrassed. And slowly, carefully, the women realized that maybe, just maybe, this was not a lie. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The next morning, a female guard led the women down a dirt path toward the river. Her name was Helen, and she had kind eyes and spoke no Japanese. She carried no weapon, just a whistle on a cord around her neck. The women walked in silence, still expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. But when they reached the riverbank, Helen simply pointed to the water, then walked about 50 feet away and turned her back. She was giving them space, privacy, just like the interpreter had promised. Kimiko felt her heart stop. She looked at the other women. Their faces showed the same confusion, the same disbelief. A bath? In a river? With privacy? It had to be a trick. Maybe they would be taken to the river and shot. Maybe this was how the Americans killed their prisoners, by giving them false hope first. But the interpreter's face was calm. The guard looked away, as if embarrassed. And slowly, carefully, the women realized that maybe, just maybe, this was not a lie. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The next morning, a female guard led the women down a dirt path toward the river. Her name was Helen, and she had kind eyes and spoke no Japanese. She carried no weapon, just a whistle on a cord around her neck. The women walked in silence, still expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. But when they reached the riverbank, Helen simply pointed to the water, then walked about 50 feet away and turned her back. She was giving them space, privacy, just like the interpreter had promised. Kimiko was the first to touch the water. She knelt at the edge and dipped her fingers in. It was cool and clear, nothing like the murky, rationed water back home. She could see smooth stones at the bottom, small fish darting between them. Reiko came next, then Sachiko, and slowly the other women followed. They removed their dirty, sweat-stained clothes and waded in carefully, as if the river itself might be a trap. But it was just water. Clean, fresh water that felt like a gift from heaven. For the first time in months, they could wash properly. Reiko scrubbed her arms and face, watching the dirt and dried blood swirl away in the current. She had not felt clean since leaving Okinawa. Back home, water was rationed so strictly that families got only a few cups a day. Bathing meant a damp cloth and a bucket shared between 6 people. Here, there was a whole river, an entire river just for them. She began to cry, not from fear or sadness, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being clean again. Sachiko noticed and reached out to touch her shoulder, but said nothing. There were no words for what they were feeling. When they returned to the camp, still damp and stunned, they were called for the midday meal. The dining area was a large tent with long tables and benches. American soldiers ate on one side, prisoners on the other. The women sat together, unsure what to expect. Then the food came. Kimiko stared at her metal tray and could not believe what she was seeing. There was rice, real white rice, not the mixture of millet and sawdust they had been eating in Japan. There was canned meat, sliced and warm. There was bread, soft and white with butter. There was fruit, actual fruit, oranges and bananas that looked almost too perfect to be real. She picked up the orange and held it in both hands. In Japan, her family's last letter had mentioned eating tree bark to survive. Her little brother had written about how his stomach hurt all the time from hunger. And here, in a prison camp, she was holding an orange. She peeled it slowly, and the smell made her eyes water. When she bit into it, the sweetness exploded in her mouth. She had forgotten that food could taste like this. Around her, the other women ate in stunned silence, trying to understand how their captors had more food than their own country could provide its people. One afternoon, a large green truck rumbled into the camp. The women watched from behind the fence as American soldiers unloaded crates and crates of bottles. Sachiko recognized the shape and the red label, Coca-Cola. She had seen it once in a magazine before the war, advertised as an American luxury. A young soldier noticed her watching and walked over. He said something in English and held out a cold bottle through the fence. Sachiko hesitated, looking back at Kimiko and Reiko. The soldier smiled and nodded, pushing the bottle closer. She took it carefully, as if it might break. The glass was cold against her palm. She had never had anything cold to drink before, not like this. She twisted off the cap and took a small sip. The bubbles tickled her nose and the sweetness made her blink. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She took another sip, then another, drinking it slowly to make it last. After a week, the women were assigned light work in the camp laundry. It was not forced labor. No one shouted at them or hit them if they worked too slowly. They simply washed uniforms and linens in huge industrial machines that did most of the work automatically. Kimiko watched the machines spin and churn with a kind of amazed horror. Back in Japan, women scrubbed clothes by hand in cold water with soap made from ashes. It took hours to wash one load. Here, the machines did it in 20 minutes. There was hot water, there was endless soap that smelled like flowers. There was electricity that never seemed to run out. The abundance was so vast, it felt almost obscene. An American nurse named Dorothy worked in the camp infirmary. She was maybe 30 years old, with brown hair pinned back and a wide, easy smile. She started learning Japanese phrases from a small book she carried in her pocket. She would stop by the women's hut in the evenings and practice. "Konbanwa," she would say, trying to get the sounds right. "Good evening." The women would correct her gently, and she would laugh at her own mistakes. One evening, Dorothy brought a box of donated civilian clothes, dresses and blouses that American women back home had sent for the prisoners. She also brought magazines, glossy and colorful, full of pictures of American houses and cars and families. Reiko flipped through one slowly, staring at a photo of a kitchen with a refrigerator and an electric stove. She had been taught that Americans had no culture, no honor, no real civilization. But these magazines showed ordinary people living in a kind of comfort she had never imagined possible. Dorothy showed them photos of her own family, her husband in his army uniform, her two little girls in matching dresses standing in front of a farmhouse in Iowa. She spoke about them with such warmth that Reiko felt something crack inside her chest. These people were supposed to be monsters, demons. But Dorothy talked about her daughters the same way Reiko's mother talked about her, with love and worry and hope for the future. How could the enemy be just like them? At night, when the camp was quiet and the guards were far away, Kimiko whispered to the others in the darkness. "If they have all this," she said, her voice barely audible, "why are we losing? What else did they lie to us about?" No one answered, but everyone was thinking the same thing. The walls they had built in their minds were beginning to crack. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. On August 15, 1945, the camp commander gathered everyone in the main courtyard. American soldiers stood on one side, prisoners on the other. The commander's face was serious but not angry. He spoke through the interpreter, and his words came slowly, carefully, as if he knew how much weight they carried. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito himself had announced it on the radio. The fighting had stopped. No more bombs, no more dying. It was finished. Kimiko felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Surrender. The word she had been taught to fear more than death itself. Japan had surrendered. The empire had fallen. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, had crumbled to dust. Around her, women began to weep. Some fell to their knees. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they had just heard. Sachiko covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Reiko stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her eyes dry. Kimiko felt numb, hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside her chest and pulled out everything that mattered. But the Americans did not celebrate in front of them. They did not cheer or mock or gloat. They simply nodded and walked away, giving the prisoners space to grieve. That small act of respect cut deeper than any insult could have. These people, who had every right to celebrate their victory, chose silence instead. Kimiko did not know what to do with that knowledge. 3 weeks later, the camp held a delayed 4th of July celebration. The commander explained through the interpreter that they had planned to celebrate on the actual date, but the war had ended and everything had been postponed. Now, with peace finally real, they wanted to honor their Independence Day properly. The prisoners were invited to join. Not forced, invited. The women did not understand why. They were still prisoners, still the enemy, even if the war was over. But the invitation was genuine, and slowly, cautiously, they agreed to come. The celebration was held in the open field beside the mess tent. Long tables were set up under the trees, covered with white cloths that flapped gently in the breeze. And then the food came. Kimiko had thought she understood American abundance by now, but this was something else entirely. There were platters of roasted chicken, golden and steaming, the skin crispy and glistening with fat. There were bowls of potato salad, creamy and dotted with green herbs. There were ears of corn, buttered and salted. There were thick slices of watermelon, red and sweet and dripping with juice. And at the end of the table, there were tubs of ice cream, 3 different flavors, scooped into small bowls and topped with cherries. Sachiko stood in front of the table and felt her knees go weak. She had not seen this much food in one place in her entire life. Not at weddings, not at festivals, not even before the war. Back home, people were starving. Her mother had written that neighbors were dying from hunger, that children had stopped growing because their bodies had nothing to grow on. And here, at a prison camp, there was ice cream. Ice cream. She reached out and took a bowl with shaking hands. The cold shocked her fingers. She lifted the spoon to her mouth and tasted it, and the sweetness was so intense she had to close her eyes. Then she began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere she did not know existed. An American soldier sitting nearby looked concerned and asked if she was okay. The interpreter translated. Sachiko could not answer. How could she explain? How could she say that she was crying because she finally understood what they had been fighting against? Not cruelty, not evil, abundance, joy. A country so rich it could fight a war on two sides of the world and still have ice cream for a summer party. She had been told America was weak, soft, decadent. But this was not weakness. This was power beyond anything Japan could ever match. Reiko sat at one of the tables, watching American soldiers laugh and play guitars. Filipino children from a nearby village ran between the tables, their faces bright with happiness. An American nurse was teaching a little girl how to blow bubbles. It was such an ordinary scene, so normal and peaceful that it felt impossible. She thought about all the propaganda she had believed. Americans were supposed to be heartless monsters who cared only about money and violence. But these people sang songs and played with children and shared their food with prisoners who had tried to kill them just months ago. It did not make sense. Or maybe it made too much sense, and that was the problem. That night, Reiko sat on her bunk and wrote in the small notebook Dorothy had given her. Her handwriting was careful and slow. "I was taught that Americans were devils," she wrote. "But devils do not share their food. Devils do not let you swim in their rivers. Devils do not smile when they see you laugh. I do not know what to believe anymore. Everything I was told was a lie. Or maybe it was worse than a lie. Maybe it was the exact opposite of the truth." A few days later, Kimiko found Dorothy in the infirmary folding bandages. She had been practicing her English, and she wanted to ask a question that had been burning inside her for weeks. She approached slowly, unsure if she had the courage. Dorothy looked up and smiled. "Kimiko-san," she said warmly, "how are you today?" Kimiko took a breath and spoke carefully, each word chosen with care. "Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemy." Dorothy stopped folding and looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped closer and spoke gently. "No, honey, the war is your enemy. You're just a girl far from home." The words hit Kimiko like a physical blow. She felt something inside her collapse, something she had been holding on to without realizing it. The propaganda had taught her that she was a soldier for the empire, a servant of the emperor, a piece of a great machine. But Dorothy saw her as just a girl, just a person, far from home, and scared, and trying to survive. It was such a simple truth, but it shattered everything else. That night, lying in her bunk, Kimiko stared at the ceiling and finally understood. The propaganda was not just exaggerated. It was not just wrong. It was a complete inversion of reality, designed to keep them afraid and obedient until the very end. The women now saw clearly what they had been blind to before. America's power came not from cruelty, but from prosperity. Japan's leaders had sent them to die for an empire that couldn't even feed its own people, while America fought on two fronts and still had ice cream. In late 1945, the women were told they would be going home. The American military had arranged ships to take Japanese prisoners back across the Pacific. Kimiko, Reiko, and Sachiko packed their few belongings into small canvas bags the Americans had given them. Kimiko carefully wrapped a bar of American soap in cloth and tucked it into the bottom of her bag. She also kept a flattened Hershey's chocolate wrapper and a photograph Dorothy had given her, the one showing Dorothy smiling beside the river with her arm around Kimiko's shoulders. These small objects felt important, like proof that what had happened was real and not some strange dream. The ship journey took 2 weeks. The women stood on the deck as Japan came into view, a gray line on the horizon that grew larger with each passing hour. Kimiko felt her stomach tighten with fear and something else she could not name. She was going home, but home was not the place she had left. The war had changed everything. She had changed everything. How could she go back to being the girl who believed everything she was told? When the ship docked in Yokohama, the women were processed through a repatriation center and given train tickets to their hometowns. Kimiko's journey took her west toward Osaka. She pressed her face against the train window and watched the countryside roll past. What she saw made her heart sink. The cities were destroyed. Buildings stood in ruins, their walls blackened by fire, their roofs collapsed into piles of rubble. People walking along the roads looked thin and hollow, their clothes hanging loose on their bodies. Children with dirty faces and bare feet sat beside the tracks, watching the train pass with empty eyes. The ship journey took 2 weeks. The women stood on the deck as Japan came into view, a gray line on the horizon that grew larger with each passing hour. Kimiko felt her stomach tighten with fear and something else she could not name. She was going home, but home was not the place she had left. The war had changed everything. She had changed everything. How could she go back to being the girl who believed everything she was told? When the ship docked in Yokohama, the women were processed through a repatriation center and given train tickets to their hometowns. Kimiko's journey took her west toward Osaka. She pressed her face against the train window and watched the countryside roll past. What she saw made her heart sink. The cities were destroyed. Buildings stood in ruins, their walls blackened by fire, their roofs collapsed into piles of rubble. People walking along the roads looked thin and hollow, their clothes hanging loose on their bodies. Children with dirty faces and bare feet sat beside the tracks, watching the train pass with empty eyes. When Kimiko finally reached her town, she almost did not recognize it. The bicycle shop her father had run was gone, burned down during an air raid. Her family was living in a makeshift shelter made from scrap wood and metal sheets. Her mother had aged 10 years in the time Kimiko had been gone. Her father walked with a limp from an injury he wouldn't talk about. Her little brother, who had been 12 when she left, was now 14 and looked like an old man. He was so thin she could see every bone in his face. Her mother cried when she saw her, clutching Kimiko's face in her rough, work-worn hands. "You're alive," she kept saying. "You're alive." But Kimiko could barely speak. She looked around at the ruins of her hometown, at the hunger in her family's eyes, and felt the weight of what she had learned pressing down on her chest. She reached into her bag and pulled out the bar of soap. Her mother held it like it was made of gold. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Kimiko hesitated, then said quietly, "The Americans gave it to me." Her father's face darkened, but he said nothing. There was too much pain, too much shame for words. Reiko's journey took her south to Okinawa, but when she arrived, there was almost nothing left. The battle for Okinawa had been one of the bloodiest of the entire war. Whole villages had been erased. The land was scarred with craters and littered with unexploded shells. Reiko found what remained of her family living in a cave, too afraid to come out, even though the fighting had stopped months ago. Her mother had died during the battle. Her father had lost his mind from the trauma and no longer recognized her. Her younger sister, only 16, was taking care of him alone. Reiko went back to work as a nurse, treating civilians in a makeshift clinic set up in the ruins of a school. She had almost no supplies, no medicine, no bandages, no clean water. She watched people die from infections that could have been easily treated with the antibiotics she had seen the Americans use so casually. She thought about the abundance of the camp, the industrial kitchen, the endless soap and clean sheets, and felt a deep, aching irony settle in her bones. She had been captured and held prisoner, and those months had been the most humane part of the entire war. Her own people had sent her into hell, but the enemy had treated her like a human being. Sachiko returned to Kyoto and found her family's house still standing, though the windows were broken and the roof leaked. Her parents were alive, but broken in ways that couldn't be healed. Her father had worked in a factory that made airplane parts, and he blamed himself for the defeat. Her mother spent her days staring at the wall, speaking to no one. Sachiko tried to tell them about her time in the camp, about the kindness she had experienced, but they did not want to hear it. To them, surrender was still the greatest shame. To speak of American kindness was to betray everything they had suffered for. So Sachiko stayed quiet. She married a man she barely knew, another survivor who asked no questions about the war. They built a small life together, working hard and saying little. Years passed, decades. She had a daughter, then a granddaughter. And for a long time, she kept her memories locked away, too painful and too strange to share. But one day, when her daughter was old enough to ask, Sachiko finally spoke. They were sitting in the kitchen, peeling vegetables for dinner. Her daughter asked, "Mama, what was it like, being a prisoner?" Sachiko put down her knife and looked out the window. "They let us swim in the river," she said quietly, "and they gave us ice cream." Her daughter looked confused. "I don't understand." Sachiko turned to face her, and her eyes were wet. "I learned that the enemy we feared most treated us better than our own leaders ever did." 50 years after the war ended, Kimiko sat down and wrote a memoir. Her hands were old and twisted with arthritis, but she forced them to move across the page. She wrote about the camp, about Dorothy, about the river, the ice cream, and the moment she realized everything she had believed was a lie. In the final chapter, she wrote these words: "They let us swim in the river. Such a small thing. But in that river, I washed away the lies I had been told. I emerged not as a prisoner, but as someone who finally saw the truth. Dignity is not found in dying for a cause. It is found in how we treat each other when we have every reason not to." On a warm spring afternoon, an elderly Kimiko stood beside a river near her home in Japan. She held the faded photograph of Dorothy in her wrinkled hands. The edges were worn soft from years of handling. Dorothy was probably gone by now, an old woman like herself, or perhaps already passed. But in the photo, she was young and smiling, her arm around a frightened Japanese girl who did not yet understand that mercy was possible. Kimiko looked at the water flowing past, the cool touch of it on her skin, the feeling of being clean for the first time in months. The moment she realized that even in war, kindness could survive. She smiled, tucked the photo back into her pocket, and walked slowly home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.